So we'll go to screen sharing, and we're going to look at the aquatic biomes. We're not going to go into as much detail as we did on the terrestrial biomes since the book doesn't talk about them at all, but we are going to focus on them. When we look at aquatic biomes, even more so than the terrestrial biomes, aquatic biomes are subdivided in all sorts of different ways. There are usually 4 biomes that are recognized, but sometimes more. Lakes and ponds is one of the biomes. Rivers and streams is a second one. And notice that lakes and ponds and rivers and streams are all freshwater biomes. They all contain water that has a relatively low concentration of salt solutes. And when we say salt solutes, we're talking about sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride ions, sulfate ions, things like that. Now, even though it's called fresh water, they do have some of those ions in them. One of the problems we have here in Chicago is we have hard water. And hard water has a large amount of calcium ions and magnesium ions in it. And the reason that hard water can be a problem is if you've ever had some water that you left sitting in a bathtub or a sink for a while, and then you let it drain, you have kind of a ring around the side. And that ring around the side is actually calcium and magnesium that has precipitated out of the water. So we have 2 freshwater biomes. We have the rivers and streams, the lakes and ponds. We also have a seawater or saltwater biome, oceans and seas. And the oceans and seas aren't typically subdivided any further. However, we also have a 4th biome called estuaries. And estuaries are a biome that we can observe where freshwater meets saltwater. So we see it most often where rivers flow into the ocean. But it does form in a couple of other areas as well. So let's start out by thinking about a freshwater biome, rivers and lakes. So when we look at a lake, there are different ways to think about dividing up this biome into smaller ecosystems or communities. So one area of the lake, if we want to think of the lake and divide it up by kind of the region where it's located, is the benthic zone. And the benthic zone is simply the bottom of the lake bed. So this extends all the way from the shoreline where the water ends to the deepest part of the lake. Now, we can also think about dividing the lake up into 2 areas, and one is called the littoral zone. The littoral zone is where we have plants growing in the lake. And we'll talk a little bit later about how far down this extends, but the littoral zone actually is equivalent to the euphotic zone, or it's sometimes called just the plain photic zone if we're looking at a lake. So we have the littoral zone. This is where we have plants growing. And we have the limnetic zone, which is open water. And notice if we look at the benthic zone underneath the limnetic zone, there are no plants growing on the bottom in this region. And that's because the top part of the lake is called the euphotic or just the plain photic zone. And this is how far down light reaches. So we can't have plants, we can't have photosynthetic organisms growing deeper than this level. Typically, the euphotic zone ends at about 200 meters under the surface of the water. So 200 meters, 600 feet, a little bit over. Now, local conditions like how muddy the water is and how much silt and sediment is carried into the lake by nearby rivers or streams, how much erosion there is, this can affect this. It's really about 200 meters at its greatest depth. It's usually, if there's a change, it's usually less than that because the water is cloudier. Technically, the euphotic zone is defined as being all the way down in the water until we reach a point where only 1% of the light that hit the surface of the water penetrates. When we get to the point where only 1% of the light that hit the surface penetrates, so 100% of the light hits up here. When we get down to the bottom of this arrow by the euphotic zone, the tip of the arrow is 1%. Below that is the aphotic zone. A at the beginning of a word means not or without. So the aphotic zone doesn't have any light. So there's no photosynthesis at that point. Now notice, since the aphotic zone, we don't reach that till we get to about 600 feet below the surface of the water. A lot of lakes, the entire lake is the littoral zone or the euphotic zone. Because if you would go out, there's a little lake around here called Wolf Lake. Wolf Lake doesn't have a depth of 600 feet. The entire lake is the littoral zone and the euphotic zone. If we look at Lake Michigan, we might think of Lake Michigan as being very deep, and Lake Michigan is a lot deeper than Wolf Lake, but Lake Michigan only has a few areas where the depth is greater than 600 feet or 200 meters. So most of Lake Michigan is in the euphotic zone. There are a couple of areas, especially more in the northern part of Lake Michigan, where the water is so deep, there's an aphotic zone. So we can think of dividing up the lake in terms of how much light is in it, the euphotic zone versus the aphotic zone. We can think of dividing it up according to whether it's what we call open water, where there aren't plants growing, or whether there are some underwater plants growing, the littoral zone. And notice that littoral zone not only contains underwater plants, it contains plants like lily pads that float on the surface, and it contains emergent plants that stick out of the water, like cattails. So there are several different types of plants. Now, when we look at rivers and lakes, and we think about how much water they contain, they don't really contain a large amount of the Earth's water. In fact, if we look at all the fresh water on the Earth, all the fresh water on the Earth only makes up about 3% of the total amount of water. A little bit more, maybe 3.5%. But most of the water in the world is seawater, salt water. Now, when we look at how lakes are formed, one of the things that we see is a lot of times the factors that form lakes form a lot of lakes in one area. So if we look at a map of the Great Lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, and notice there are some other pretty big areas in here. There's a Lake Niprongo up here in Canada. There's Georgian Bay over here on the side of Lake Huron. There's Lake St. Clair down here. If we look at all these lakes, they were formed by the same geological processes. Thousands of years ago, keep in mind that the Earth is in the middle of an ice age right now, even though we have global warming. That's how people are kind of messing things up. But when we look at an ice age, we have glacial periods, and during glacial periods, the amount of snow and ice covering the Earth expands. And we have interglacial periods where the amount of snow and ice contracts. And during the last glacial period of the ice age that we're in right now, as the ice advanced, keep in mind, we're talking about ice that's several miles thick in the glaciers that were moving southward from Canada. As the ice advanced, the weight of this several mile thick sheet of ice scooped out a lot of the dirt. And as it scooped out the dirt, it created depressions in the ground. Then when we entered the interglacial period and the glaciers started to retreat, as the glaciers started to retreat and melt, the water that melted from them formed the Great Lakes, as well as these other small bodies of water. And since the glaciers are scooping up all this dirt and kind of pushing it in front of them, when the glaciers start to retreat, the glaciers leave a pile of this dirt behind. And this pile of dirt that they leave behind has actually given its name to some areas in the Chicago region. Does anybody know what this pile of dirt that glaciers leave behind is called?
Called a moraine.
Right. It's called a moraine. So some of you have probably heard there's another community college called Moraine Valley. So there are moraines lots of places, not just in Moraine Valley. But so the moraines that we see, kind of the ridges of earth, the Great Lakes first getting scooped out and then getting filled with water, this is all the result of glacial action. We see a similar occurrence if we look at some lakes called the Finger Lakes that are in upper New York State. There are 11 Finger Lakes. They're all very narrow, which is why they were called Finger Lakes. They all run north and south. And again, they were kind of scooped out by glacial action and then filled when the glaciers melted. But glaciers aren't the only thing that can form, associated groups of lakes. If you would go to Kenya, there are some lakes called the Rift Valley Lakes. And in this case, the Rift Valley Lakes have been created when we have tectonic plates, those things that are floating on the magma, tectonic plates starting to pull apart a little bit. And when they pull apart, we get kind of cracks in the ground, big cracks. And in Africa, these cracks have filled with water to become the Rift Valley Lakes. So a lot of times we find lakes kind of associated. If we go just north of us, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, is their state motto. Now, despite the fact that we may think of lakes like Lake Michigan as being really deep, the largest, deepest lake in the world is Lake Baikal, which is in Russia. And it reaches a maximum depth of about 1,640 meters. So that's about 5,000 feet. There are places in the ocean much deeper than that. There aren't really any lakes that are even real close to this. So here's a depth map of Lake Baikal, and you can see what I was talking about before. The deeper the bluish color, the deeper the water is there. So you can see a deep patch up here. You can see another deep patch down here. You can see a lot of the lake is kind of a middle depth, and then, not too surprisingly, close to shoreline, the lake is relatively shallow. Right now, there's a lot of controversy with Lake Baikal in Russia because there are so many tourists visiting it. It's leading to some environmental problems. Like we find with a lot of natural wonders, there's some controversy about how much economic development should be allowed to occur and how much that economic development might ruin it in the long run. So when we look at lakes, although they can be important sources of water, we get our fresh water from Lake Michigan. It is purified before we drink it. But at the same time, lakes really have just a small portion of the overall water in the world. I mentioned about 3.5% or so of water is typically found in fresh water. And most of that is found in the polar ice caps in Antarctica and Greenland and the Arctic and in various glaciers. So really out of this 3 to 3.5% that's fresh water, lakes are only about a 10th or 100th of that. So less than 1%. Now let's think about estuaries. Estuaries are bodies of water, and they're usually defined as being partially enclosed by land. Now what we mean when we say they're partially enclosed, think about a lake. if we go back to our map of the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan is pretty much completely enclosed by land. There's a little connection to Lake Huron. Notice this area down here is Green Bay, which I'm sure you've heard of. But if we look at an estuary is only partially enclosed. Now, a lot of lakes have another lake flowing into them or a river flowing into them. Estuaries have either rivers or streams. So our schematic diagram here shows one large river and a couple of smaller streams up on the top, but they are partly connected to the ocean as well. So seawater moves in with the tides and with large waves, and if there are events like hurricanes. So these areas are places where fresh water mixes with salt water. And when we don't have water that's quite as salty as ocean water, and it's not quite as fresh as the water in the rivers and streams and lakes, this is called brackish water. And brackish means salty. It's not as salty as seawater, but it is a little bit salty. A lot of times, if you look above at photographs, you can see a difference in watercolor. So this is an area in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. And if you look up towards the top, you can see very bluish water, which is the water coming in from the rivers. And down below, we can see more kind of greenish water, the water coming in from the ocean. And where the ocean water and the water coming in from the rivers mix, this brackish water contains a lot of nutrients. Why? Well, rivers pick up dirt particles, decaying organisms. So rivers are carrying a lot of sediment downstream as they move. And seawater also has a lot of nutrients. The reason we call it saltwater sometimes is because it does have, compared to fresh water, high concentrations of chloride ions, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium ions. And when these different mixtures of nutrients get together, it turns out to be even better for living organisms. So in this diagram, notice the estuary could be this area on the land. I'm not sure whether this photo was taken at low tide or high tide, but if this is low tide, then some of this area that looks like it's beach is really the littoral zone. Now, if you look carefully, you can see some sandbars in the back. So this is all part of the littoral zone in this area, but notice that really the river water kind of has to come out in this gap here. So when we look at estuaries, because we have all these nutrients and we have different types of nutrients coming in from the rivers and streams versus what the seawater is bringing in, one of the things that we see is that if we look at the net primary productivity. Now, remember when we talked about primary productivity a few days ago with food, biomass, energy pyramids, we said gross primary productivity is how much organic material the producers make, the photosynthesizers. Net primary productivity is how much of this is left after they carry out aerobic cell respiration. Well, notice estuaries are at the same level as swamps and marshes and tropical rainforests. You might not think of estuaries or swamps and marshes as actually producing as much organic material as rainforests, but they do. And notice they produce more by a pretty wide margin than temperate forests or boreal forests or the grasslands, or obviously deserts and the tundra are way down here. So they're very productive in terms of what they make. A lot of organisms rely on these areas for food because of the nutrients because of the nutrients mixing, there are usually a lot of small invertebrates in these areas. And where you have a lot of small invertebrates in the water, you have a lot of small fish. And so this provides food for birds and bigger fish to eat. Now notice when we measure the net primary productivity, we have to do something that we did before, which is, remember we looked at rates whenever we looked at mathematical expressions this semester. We said, for instance, you couldn't just look at how many people were born in a country, because whether that was really a high birth rate or a low birth rate depended on how many people lived in the country to start with. You know, if you have 10 people born to a population of 100, that population is growing faster than if you have 10 people born to a population of 1,000,000. So here we are measuring net primary productivity in how many kilocalories of energy they produce. Remember, some of those pyramids we looked at were energy pyramids, but the number of kilocalories per square meter per year. So we're always looking at the same size area and for the same length of time. And by doing this, this allows us to compare something like deserts, which might occupy a lot more land space than estuaries do, but which are less productive, because this is how much productivity do you get out of 1 square meter for 1 year. So we always have to think about that when we do things mathematically, is equalizing what we're comparing. Now notice that the organisms that live in these environments have evolved in unique ways. They've adapted to be able to live in brackish water, so water that isn't seawater, water that isn't fresh water, and changing conditions. Because when we look at estuaries, when the tide comes in, there's more salt water, more seawater in the mixture. When the tide goes out, there's less seawater in the mixture. One of the environmental problems that we see with estuaries is, since estuaries is where rivers flow into the ocean, and we use rivers for transportation, a lot of estuaries are destroyed by human activities. One of the main problems this creates, we actually hear about this a lot, and we'll be hearing about it in another 3 months or so when we start talking about the hurricane season. Because when we look at cities like New Orleans that have had some devastating hurricanes, part of the problem is that a lot of the estuary land area at the mouth of the Mississippi River has been altered by human activities. And one of the advantages, these estuaries soak up those tidal surges that you hear about when you hear about hurricanes. They soak up some of that extreme precipitation that you hear about when you hear about hurricanes. So when you eliminate some of the estuaries, or at least cut them back in an area, that area doesn't have as much of a buffer before the precipitation, before the tidal surges hit land, instead of being soaked up in these estuaries. So they are very important, not just because of their role in ecology, but because of their role in protecting human cities and areas near water. Now, if we move further out from the estuary, we can look at oceans and seas. And this is really where most of the water is. Somewhere between 96 and 97% of the water on Earth is found in the oceans. It's salt water or seawater. Notice that that means that unless we have an energy efficient way of desalinating seawater, taking salt out of it, most of the water on the Earth isn't really usable by people. There are a lot of ways to desalinate seawater. The problem is most of them are very slow and they're not very efficient if you're trying to produce enough fresh water for a large population. Although, like all other technologies, our technology is improving. right now, we don't have a really good energy efficient technology for removing salt from seawater. The best ones are solar power. So there are some of the countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, that gets a large percentage of its water from desalination plants, plants that take the salt out of seawater. So let's look at the oceanic divisions. And keep in mind, we have a littoral zone again. Now remember, the littoral zone was where we potentially saw plant growth when we looked at lakes and ponds. And the same thing is true here. The littoral zone, we usually think about as being on the ground, or maybe I should say on the bed of the ocean. And it corresponds to the photic zone or euphotic zone. And the littoral zone in most ocean areas is roughly the area between the high water mark when high tide comes in and the low water mark when the water goes out. The littoral zone usually extends down a little bit below the low water mark. But again, like we saw in lakes, the photic zone is about 200 meters deep. Now, if we look at the land and we're thinking about the ocean where it butts up against a continent rather than a small island like the Hawaiian Islands, we see that this whole area that's underwater is the benthic zone again. So when we talk about benthic animals, we're talking about things that live on the bottom of the ocean. Now we have the littoral zone up here. Below that, we have a region called the sublittoral zone. Sub means below, or the shelf zone. Now, notice if we look at the land here that the land is sloping downward, but it's sloping downward kind of gently. And that's because this part of the land, if we look at a continent, is called the continental shelf. So that's why this is sometimes called the shelf zone. Now, at some point, the continental shelf zone stops and the elevation or the depth of the water, depending on which we're looking at, starts to decrease more rapidly. And this area is sometimes called the continental slope. And if we look at the benthic zone here, it's sometimes divided into three different areas. There's the bathyal zone, which extends from about 1,000 meters to about 4,000 meters under the surface of the water. So notice that's roughly, if you think about meters, that's 3,000 feet to about 12,000 feet. There's the abyssal region or abyssal zone, which extends from about 3,000 meters down to about 6,000 meters. A few years ago, there was a science fiction movie made about an underwater expedition called The Abyss. And then if we go below the abyssal region, below about 6,000 meters down to about 11,000 meters, this is the hadal zone. Think of Hades, what's down south according to Christianity. So the hadal zone is the deepest zone. And the hadal zone is often found in what we call oceanic trenches, the very deepest parts of the ocean. So depending on who you read, this whole area might be called the benthic zone, or it might be subdivided into the littoral, the shelf, the bathyal, the abyssal, and the hadal. Now, similarly, the water is also subdivided. Remember, if we go back to our lake, this part of the lake where we have open water is called the limnetic zone. If we look at the ocean, we don't usually refer to anything as the limnetic zone. The area where fish can swim freely is called the pelagic zone. And so all of this blue water here is the pelagic zone, and it comes in, again, a couple of different subdivisions. The epipelagic zone is basically equivalent to the photic zone, or the euphotic zone. Epi means above. And so this is above the other layers. So the epipelagic zone is the zone of water down to about 200 meters where at least 1% of the light that hit the surface of the ocean penetrates. So this is where we find photosynthesizing organisms. Below that, we have the mesopelagic zone, which corresponds mostly to the shelf zone, if we're looking at the benthic divisions. And then we have the bathypelagic zone, the abyssal pelagic zone, and the hadal pelagic zone. Now, as we go further and further down in the water, there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. First of all, as we go down in the water, pressure increases. If you've ever gone scuba diving and you've gone more than about 20 feet down, you're very aware of this. Here, standing on the Earth's surface, there's gases pressing down on our body. And these gases exert 1 atmosphere of pressure, or we sometimes refer to 760 millimeters of mercury, or 760 torrs if you were taking a chemistry class. When you go down under the water, scuba diving, or if you're a fish, just swimming, for every 10 meters you go down, about 30 feet, technically 30.06 or 30.08, but for about every 10 meters, there's another atmospheric pressure that presses on your body. So if you're a fish swimming 30 feet under the ocean, there are 2 atmospheres of pressure pressing on your body. If you're 60 feet under the ocean, there are 3 atmospheres of pressure. If you're 90 feet under the ocean surface, there are 4 atmospheres of pressure. So the pressure increases as we go down in the water. And this is constant. Basically, think of this pressure as being due to the pile of air and then the pile of water that's on top of a fish or a scuba diver at any particular depth. Now, as we go down in the water, there are other changes in the environment as well. If we look at the air, air is about 21% oxygen, not quite. Anytime air comes in contact with water, some of the gases in the air dissolve in the water. So if we look at the surface water up in this epipelagic or photic zone, this is where the concentration of oxygen is highest. For oxygen to get down to these lower levels, it has to gradually diffuse down to those levels. So diffusion is slow, so the concentration of oxygen is higher up in this upper zone. It's also high for another reason. The photic zone is where we have photosynthesizing organisms living. And remember that oxygen is one of the products of photosynthesis. So here is where most of the oxygen that diffused into the water is found. Here's also where oxygen that's produced by photosynthesis is found. So there's less and less and less oxygen as we go down. Typically somewhere around 1,000 meters, we reach our minimum oxygen levels. And then it goes up just slightly after that point. So when we look at these oxygen levels, if we want some numbers to think about comparing them, there are about 200 milligrams of oxygen in 1 liter of air. If we look at water right at the surface where it's well oxygenated, there's only about 8 milligrams of oxygen in 1 liter of water. So notice air has about 25 times more oxygen than the water does. By the time we get down to 1,000 meters, oxygen levels have declined to somewhere between about 2 and 4 milligrams per liter. I'm not sure why, but they're slightly lower in the Pacific. The 2 is what we see more in the Pacific, and the 4 is more what we see in the Atlantic. After this, they increase a little bit, not much. So here are some of those photosynthesizing. Notice that in this case, unlike many of the slides we look at, this slide has not been stained. So all these things that are green, these are all organisms that carry out photosynthesis. They're green because they have chlorophyll. Now, these organisms that are microscopic, although they haven't been stained, they have been magnified, are called phytoplankton. Phyto means plant. Remember, we talked about some things like epiphytes, lycophytes. Phyte means plant. Plankton means things that just drift on the current. So these are some of the organisms that we find in that first 200 meters, that photic zone. So the pressure increases as we go down in the water. The amount of oxygen available for living organisms decreases. At the oxygen minimum layer around 1,000 meters, there's actually so little oxygen that a lot of organisms can't survive in this water. They have to be above this by 100 meters or so, or they have to swim through this and get down below this layer where the levels have increased slightly. The other thing that changes is temperature. If we look in the photic zone or the epipelagic zone, the temperature really is often similar to air temperature. In winter, the water is usually slightly warmer than the air temperature above it. In summer, the temperature of the water is usually slightly cooler. And this goes back to what we talked about the other day. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of the water. So while the air warms up relatively quickly, the water is slower to warm up. In the winter, the air loses its heat energy relatively quickly. The water has to lose a lot of heat energy to lower its temperature. Once we get below the photic zone, the temperature is actually fairly uniform. The temperature is around 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And it only goes down to about 3 degrees Celsius, about 37 degrees Fahrenheit, when we get to the greatest depths. Now remember, on the Celsius scale, 0 degrees Celsius is freezing. And if you think about this on the Fahrenheit scale, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is very, very cold water. You would not be happy in this water. So the environment changes as we go down through the various layers of the ocean, but there are a lot of organisms that are free to swim back and forth. When we look at mammals like whales, have been recorded diving at least into the bathypelagic and the abyssopelagic levels. It's not clear that they ever get down to the hadopelagic level. So we see kind of corresponding areas on the shore and also in the open water. Now, one of the things we see once we get down past about 1,000 meters, it's very difficult to study the benthic organisms that live on the bottom of the ocean, or it's difficult to study fish that live down in these areas and never come up higher, because the animals on the bottom of the ocean, the fish that live here and never come up, microorganisms in this area, they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. And oxygen levels are very low and there's no light. So they aren't really very well adapted to survive at the surface. So if we do a scientific expedition and we try to bring them up to the surface, they don't survive very well. And if they survive, we have another problem. How do we keep them in a lab? Keep in mind, some of these animals down in the depths of the ocean are at 100 atmospheric pressures. Takes a lot of energy to maintain that type of temperature in an aquarium. So it's a very expensive proposition, and it's a proposition that doesn't always work. Now, what do organisms do that live down in these levels below the photic zone where there's no light? Because fish in this area, some of the other types of organisms we find, still have eyes. And what we find is a couple of different strategies. One of the things we find as we go down in the water is that there are a lot of animals that are bioluminescent. This is not a retouched photo. This is an actual photo. You might be able to tell by the outline. This is actually a squid. And this squid contains chemicals in its cells that carry out a chemical reaction. And this chemical reaction releases light. So it's a type of exothermic or exergonic reaction, and it releases light. So this squid has different parts of its body that literally glow. Now, for animals that do this, they have a chemical called luciferin. And luciferin is the chemical that they break down. And they break it down using an enzyme called luciferase. Remember that ace at the end of a word means enzyme. And when luciferase breaks down luciferin, this is the reaction that occurs in fireflies, by the way. When luciferase breaks down luciferin, light is released. So these organisms glow. Now, some animals actually get the chemicals from symbiotic bacteria that are living in their body. Or some of them get it by eating a type of crustacean called seed shrimp. But this is the reaction that produces this glowing. Notice that there are some protista that can do this as well. Now, notice that I think luciferin and luciferase are interesting because I suspect that most of you have heard of someone called Lucifer. What does Lucifer mean? We all know that Lucifer is another name for the devil, a fallen angel, right? But what does Lucifer actually mean? Lucifer means light bringer. So luciferin and luciferase are the two chemicals that are needed for organisms to produce their own light. There are very few organisms that use a different metabolic pathway, but this is by far the most common one. Now, if we look at another thing that animals do, this is a photo of something called a swell shark. Swell sharks don't have luciferin and luciferase. They have a chemical in their cells that absorbs light, usually blue light. And the reason it's usually blue light for animals that do this is because the reason water is blue is because water scatters the blue wavelengths. So blue isn't absorbed when it hits water. So that means if you live further down in the ocean, there's still some blue light available. The other colors are mostly absorbed before they get very deep. In any case, in this process, blue light is absorbed and it stimulates the chemicals. And when it stimulates the chemicals, the light is re-emitted, but it's re-emitted as a different color, or remember when we talked about photosynthesis back in 105, a different color really means a different wavelength also. So animals that do this are usually red or green or purple. So this is a swell shark. Swell sharks happen to be kind of green. And this is called biofluorescence. They fluoresce. There are some minerals that fluoresce when you shine light on them of the right wavelength. They will glow a certain color. Now, you might wonder why organisms would do this. And basically, lighting up one way or another seems to be mostly communication. If you're down in total darkness, one thing that's difficult to do is attract a mate. So this is one way to attract a mate. Now, you might think that there would be a problem with this, that it's going to attract predators. But keep in mind, to be able to see these, you have to have eyes that respond to these wavelengths of light. So in some cases, there's evidence that the predators may not be able to actually see these wavelengths. But there's also evidence that, crazy as it seems, lighting up like this might be a way to scare off predators. If you light up, imagine you're a predator. You're down here in this dark environment, you're going to eat this squid, it lights up. Wait a minute, everybody can see the squid now for miles around. You really want to hang around and take a chance that you get to eat this squid before some bigger predator comes along and eats you? So it seems to be a deterrent to predators in the cases that we've been able to study. One of the reasons that we have to do science is because when we think about things and we make logical conclusions, our logical conclusions are based a lot of times on incomplete knowledge. And here it seems like this should be a beacon that attracts predators, but it tends to kind of scare them off, actually. Are there any questions about the aquatic biomes that we've talked about today? Okay, if not, I will let you go and I will see you on Wednesday. We'll probably finish up our lecture on Wednesday. We may have a little bit left on Thursday, but we'll probably finish up lecture on Wednesday. And that means that if that's the case, I'll be posting ecology questions on Thursday. And like usual, this will be a big set of questions and they'll be due a week from Thursday. They'll be due, so next Thursday, whatever that date is, maybe the 13th, if I'm thinking correctly. And next week, there are no classes at all. That's finals week, so we won't have classes. You'll just have to turn in the last assignment by Thursday. Are there any questions about what we discussed today or anything else we've talked about with ecology? Okay, if not, I will let you go and I'll